I think it's probably time to open it up to the floor. Again, just to reiterate, if you could keep your questions fairly short, or even if you're making a point, if you say who you are and where you come from, that would be really helpful. There's a lady there.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Laura Beswick. I'm from BPP. We're a training provider. I was just wondering, Sharon, as an employer, do you make your learners sit both the endpoint assessment parts at the same time, or do you split them out?
So we haven't had anyone going through the endpoint assessment at this particular point in time. That will come November for us. And so we will go with, on this occasion, whatever we're advised to do. So it's unfortunate they're our pilot group going through. So until that happens, we can't take control. And we are an organisation that does like to control what happens, but we're operating in someone else's space. So we're giving them the control. If it doesn't work for us, we will absolutely take the control and go, what could have been done better? And how can we ensure going forward that if it goes wrong, it doesn't happen again for us?
Because I think our concern is they'll sit one element and then not do the second part.
Yeah.
And how do we ensure that they do both bits?
Yeah. And for us, you know, we would want them to do both bits. Some of them are already on permanent contracts with us, so it's in their interest to do both bits because they are with us. Those who are on fixed-term contracts with us are looking for the opportunity to remain permanently with us. So again, it's in their interest.
Yeah, so you link it, the passing, to them being able to progress. Yeah. That's excellent. Okay, thank you.
Charlotte, I just wondered if, with your experience of endpoint assessments, is that becoming an issue? So doing elements of the endpoint assessment, or having to schedule them all in?
So I can talk about the approach we've made. Is we actually work with the employer to come up with a delivery model that works best for them and their organisation. So we have some where they prefer cohort delivery, some where they want the planning meeting, the knowledge test on the same day, others where practical observation and professional discussion. So it's really about working with the employer, and then as showing as an endpoint assessment organisation, we can be flexible for it to be an addition to the programme rather than actually stipulating it. The kind of mantra we've got is it's only if it's a rule in the plan we have to stick to it, but outside of that, the only way we're going to make this work is offering that flexibility to actually hear what works for the employer rather than actually demanding what's best for us.
Okay. Is there another question in the front along here?
I'm Srila Banerjee from a Life Skills Network. Completely out of the sector, so everything that I'm hearing is new information. It just occurs to me that an enormous amount of the problems being encountered are administrative problems, and I just wondered whether the sector as a whole has considered blockchain technology.
Richard.
Online portfolios, I think, yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, not that any experts on blockchain, but I think the principle of having everything online available to all the elements, I think has sort of come through. How we do that, I would have to say this sector is probably not at the forefront of IT, and mainly because we've had to cope with some pretty clunky regulation. But I do think, without, to say, that the answer to all of this is the blockchain, there is an important point to be made that we do have to use the technologies that are available to make sure that we're managing that whole process. But I'll welcome any comments from the panel.
I'd be just interested to point out that actually the compliance part of it, the organisational chain, if you like, would also be updated at the same time.
Yeah, okay. Any views from the panel?
I think it's a bit like working with the government is a bit like working with a startup that's taken its product to market too soon. There's no real plan in place. The finance plan's not fully worked out. The product's not completely finished. And, there's a lot of revision in in making it up. Not making it up, that's unfair. That's I take that back. But it's constant. So the idea, blockchain, it could work if even the basic plan and kind of structures were there and there was some real, it's not as structured as it needs to be, in my opinion. I think it needs, anyway, I'll just be quiet because I'm being recorded.
And it is a wider issue in that you could talk about blockchain, but any long-term investment in systems or in sales processes or in internal systems are very difficult to make because you know something's going to change. And one thing you'll be sure of, something will change next week. And that is part of the problem of why the investment doesn't happen. So, but I don't think it's something we should ignore. John, I think you were next in terms of the question.
Bearing in mind we're dealing with taxpayers' money, however it's raised, can we justify that the endpoint assessment costs at least 10 times more than the previous certification? And are we getting 10 times better apprentices? If not, how do we justify this expenditure to the taxpayers?
Is that a policy question, do you think, Tom?
Yeah, well, when you say taxpayers, employers, obviously large employers over a certain threshold, they're taxpayers, they're paying into the apprenticeship levy. I think there's a healthy debate going on, not yet, I think, finalised about the extent to which some of these infrastructure costs that we've talked about, like endpoint quality assurance, should be top sliced and actually paid for centrally out of the levy. I think, ALP's looked at that. But, in the end, it comes back to what outcome are we trying to achieve as a country, and we want a world-class apprenticeship system that we're proud of. And frankly, I don't think costs should necessarily come into it, other than the cost that it should require to deliver that world-class system. And I think one of the challenges at the moment with the review of the funding bands, for example, which whilst one or two that have been leaked to the press suggest that the funding band has gone up, on the whole most of the funding bands are coming down, and at the same time it's just the government that's saying it's concerned about a race to the bottom in relation to skills and productivity. So there's a lot of mismatch out there at the moment in terms of ambition and actual reality on the ground. So I think rather than get into a sort of taxpayers alliance argument about whether or not the system is affordable, I think we've just got to get the system working effectively, with employers ultimately having confidence in this new approach.
And I think some of it comes back to having a plan. And the original apprenticeship reform plan had a line in there about investment in both providers, investment in awarding organisations, and investment in the system. I don't think any of that investment's been made. So I think that's a very valid point. Let's go to a question in the middle there. Hope I didn't miss anybody there.
Hi, my name's Tim Beasley. I work for a large employer called Electric Components, and we're a levy payer, but we're not a training provider, which I was glad to hear when I was taken on as the apprenticeship program manager. It's clear to hear that there's a lot of things being that's not very clear. I think the lady there summed it up really well, that it feels like a bit of a start-up business still going on. Is there any pushback being made to the government to extend the deadline then, so that before we actually start losing money from our levy pots because of all this uncertainty that's going on?
I'll respond immediately. I think there has been quite a lot of pushback, both from employers and training providers. So for example, the standards were all due to be in by 2018. That's been pushed back. The original plan was to spend the money in 12 months. It's now 24 months. Will there be any other changes? Who knows? Don't know whether you're involved in the employer debate about and where is it likely to be a pushback on?
We're not involved in the employer debate, but I do remember when they said it was going to be 12 months thinking, we haven't even got a structure or a plan in place. How on earth are we going to spend the money? But actually 24 months is looming pretty quickly. Yeah. And that's a big concern in terms of we've always said we will not spend all of our levy. We've always known that, and that's a business decision. But we also don't want to lose an awful lot of it at the same time. But it is going to be a real challenge, because we don't just want to do apprentices for the sake of spending the money. We want to do good quality apprentices and deliver good quality apprenticeship programs. But yeah, someone somewhere is going to be soon saying to me, how much are we about to lose if we don't hit that 24-month deadline?
Yeah. I was just thinking, well, if you've got an apprenticeship program already set up and it's running, the chances are you're already ahead of your payments, so you've probably got a bit more breathing room. But there's companies out there like ourselves that are just setting up now and about to start running, but we've then got 15, 16 months worth of payments to try and spend at the same time. So
And that definitely will be a challenge. And I've been on to, I still call it the DAS account, it's whatever it's called these days. And they have the projections for us. And the projections are still quite frightening because it means I have to do an awful lot more internally. And we are about to launch our internal offerings because most of the apprentices we have currently are new starts into our business. But I have to do something internally because otherwise the spend will catch up quite quickly.
I better move on because we're just drifting off the EPA and there might be one or two questions, but I think that's a real issue for many, many employers who cannot spend their money now. I mean, literally, otherwise, because if you start to spend it, enough for apprentices, you'll be overspending in year 2 and 3. This gentleman there, sorry, with the yellow tie.
Acronyms, not very good for dyspraxic and dyslexic people, but MAD kind of sounds like mutually assured destruction in terms of policy, but it's not very good going forward. And of course, my question to the panel is, how do you be inclusive in terms of neurodiversity in the endpoint assessment? You've got people autistic, dyspraxic and dyslexic. How do you assure the quality of the outcomes that are going forward are inclusive? That's a very important question.
This is actually one of my things that fits into that clarity box. So in the majority of assessment plans at the moment, when you're talking about what is deemed as reasonable adjustments, it says refer to your endpoint assessment organisation. And a number of different people I've spoken to have said actually they've spoken to the endpoint assessment organisation and the rules that are there are 25% extra time, which actually for the difficulties, challenges we're dealing with isn't right. So there's a piece of work that I've kicked off working with an organisation called CogniAssist, which is trying to say what are those difficulties, and then actually how can we make sure that is not just supported but through the delivery, but also then we can make sure is supported through the endpoint assessment to make those relevant changes. And we're trying to get some momentum behind this so we can go to government and say, actually, can we then have consistency and appropriate reasonable adjustments for the difficult and disabilities that we may need to consider for endpoint assessment? And I don't think Trailblazer groups thought of the diversity of apprentices. And I think this isn't beginning to be an issue, and I think we need to do something about it. So if you want to chat afterwards, I can share in further detail some of that work we're doing.
I think Sharon's comment earlier about, say, a fixed standard globally should be the point for an end assessment. I mean, I'm familiar with manufacturing. I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm a teacher, and I'm an assessor. But I'm also autistic, dyspraxic, and I'm dyslexic. And I think that like an ISO 9001 standard, just Sharon will be familiar with, it's a global like standard set through BSR. You can refer to that anywhere in the world and work through that program. You can also have a fixed assessment, and I think that's where we should be at. And consulting organizations like Dyspraxia Foundation, Dyslexia Foundation, Autism, and really having those roundtable discussions going forward, because I don't believe that you'll have the best possible outcomes if you don't do that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think it's it's very hard to disagree with you, but in the same way that I think most of the responses have been we're just not prepared, then clearly we're not prepared for those who need additional help and support. I'm absolutely sure. I'm sure we will do whatever we can, but we're just not prepared for that. And that's something I think we'll take away. And I think that's a general point, that there are a number of things that have been raised today that I hope with the number of people who are here and the sort of range of organisations, it gives a voice to some of those concerns, and we'll make sure that that's captured when we take away. I think I've got one last question, if there is one. And there's a lady towards the front here. So it'll have to be, unfortunately, the last question, I think.
Hello, I'm Julie Smith from Enable Assessment, and my question is, how important is it that the assessor is qualified as an assessor as opposed to occupationally qualified?
Well, let's start with Charlotte. I guess you've got plenty of them.
So I suppose there is that question, actually, what is a qualified assessor? Because endpoint assessment is actually very, very new. So we've got a whole bunch of people who have Carver, D32, D33, A1, V1 qualifications, and I think that's a really sound base. But we are in a new world, so from our perspective, there is still a lot of upskilling that needs to take place. Some people may not have had that direct contact with apprentices for a period of time, so how do we make sure they're able to coach and get the most out of those apprentices? Grading, reporting, all new things. So I think even if people have been assessors, there's a big upskill program that needs to take place, and we've done some work to develop an online course which we've made available free. So if people want to have a look at that, you know, it's free to anybody to utilise. In relation to the occupational competence, I think it's relevant and appropriate occupational competence. One of the challenges at the moment, which I think is becoming well documented, is when we think of health. So for a level 2 healthcare worker, the assessor is required to have a nursing PIN that is still available. It's an area we're really struggling with. So I think it's about relevant and appropriate occupational competence rather than kind of making up rules that aren't necessarily going to add value and support that journey of that apprentice.
From a policy perspective, do you think a wider...
Well, I think it's a really pertinent question, and the corollary to that, of course, is do we have enough assessors in the system to deliver the kind of volume that Richard was talking about earlier? And you know, I guess the challenge around should assessors be formally qualified or not, and I see that the Assessors Guild is exhibiting here, and there are obviously initiatives that are flowering up around that sort of concept. You know, frankly, if it acts though as a barrier to getting the volume of assessors that we'll need in the system to carry out the EPAs, then you know, maybe that, you know, making it a requirement is not probably the direction we should go in. But I think really, you know, the bigger challenge is clearly as a new and developing market, we need to ensure that that pool of talent, of assessment talent along the lines that Charlotte was you know, talking about, is actually available, whilst recognising that a lot of EPAOs, of course, are already investing heavily in their endpoint assessors, and indeed are employing them directly as opposed to necessarily in the old MVQ days when it was all about sort of freelancers. So I think it will be, again, a bit of a multi-speed model that will develop there.
And I guess from an employer perspective, I'd expect a blend of both, because I would not want an assessor coming into our organisation who had worked in a totally different environment. How could they assess and understand what our people are delivering, our apprentices are delivering, and be able to say that they have the skills, the knowledge, behaviours, and are competent to move on if they actually don't have a Scooby-Doo about the industry?
I think it's true to say that one of your 4 Cs, I think it's one of your 4 Cs, but the clarity about when is someone independent and not independent needs to be worked through. Like in the old days, most training providers did it, but it was overseen and assured. Now, I think that could be tightened up, but inevitably there's a lot of people out there, there's a lot of organisations that are working with their employers, so organising and pulling together the assessment whilst somebody else is assuring it, I think is a concept we sort of knew well before, and I think may need to be revisited. I'm really conscious of your time and in terms of the next panel as well, and want to give you as much time as you can to network, which is sometimes the most important thing. But before we do that, before we end, perhaps I could ask you to say a huge thank you to our panel who've given up their time today and gave some great answers. Thank you.